this is another screencast explaining about how to use PDO, that is a PHP extension, for displaying information from a database. The application we're going to make today is in three parts. The first part, if I show you what it looks like in finished terms, it's just, I've not bothered styling it in any way, so it's simple and straightforward. But what we're going to do is display a list of students. We're going to make one of the fields into a link so that when I click on that particular element, which is the primary key of students, is passed to a form. That form uses that primary key to retrieve the rest of the data and populate an edit form like this, where the student code, since it's the primary key, is just read-only, but the other fields we can alter, and then we can make changes to that data, click save, and it will save the information, give you some feedback, and when we go back to the student information is updated. So that's the application that we're going to construct. Okay, so let's, as always, begin with a plan. So what we're going to do is make a listing of students displayed in a table. We're going to be able to click on a student to link to an edit form, and we're going to pass the primary key, the PK, which in this case is student code. And then in that edit form, we'll need to retrieve the student code from the request stream. We'll then use that student code as part of an SQL statement so that we'll select all of the other details to do with the student where student code equals what we've retrieved from the request stream. And then we'll display an edit form with an action to save the record. And the edit form will have the values that we've retrieved from the database populating the input elements on the form itself. When the user clicks save, then the edit action will invoke a script which will retrieve data from the request stream, the data that was sent in the form. It'll create the appropriate update statement, and it will execute that statement, giving feedback to the user together with a link to go back to the original listing. Okay, so let's start off with that. Well, I'm beginning, as a matter of fact, I'm cheating slightly. I've created a CSS file. In actual fact, this is really the same as the one that I'd embedded in the HTML in the previous screencast in this series, just so that my form can be styled nicely, and you can do that yourself. And then I've also created a file that I've called common.php, which contains just a couple of simple functions, again, which have been covered elsewhere in the course of which this screencast forms a part. But just to quickly show you some of those functions, there's only two. A function to connect to the database, which will link to the PDO, the SQLite database. It's really a good idea, I find, using SQLite as a database, especially when I'm testing, simply because it's a file. I can put it on a USB stick, I can copy it around from one place to another, and it makes testing really easy. If I were to move this into a production system, then obviously I might rethink that and use SQLite or use MySQL rather, or some other database. And as part of this connect function, I've also set the attributes so that the error mode that PDO will use will be that it will raise an exception rather than an ordinary error. And then I've created a simple function called HTML header, which takes two parameters, a title to be used as part of an HTML page, and then an optional parameter that I've called CSS file, which has the value null if you don't pass it. And basically this does something very straightforward. It first of all figures out whether that's null or not here on this line 28, and if it's not empty, then this is the ternary if structure that we looked at in the last screencast. If it's not empty, then this string will be assigned to this variable, else the colon, an empty string will be assigned to that variable. So in other words, look, it's just creating a normal HTML link statement using whatever was passed as that second parameter. And then I'm creating another variable called header, which effectively constructs a simple HTML5 doc type and head section using the first parameter to this function as the title of the web page, together with that variable, which will either equal a link for the style sheet or it'll equal a blank, and then end head start the body. So basically this means, but with those just two simple functions, when we start to write the PHP code, I can really just stay writing PHP. I don't need to come in and out of HTML so much to put headers and footers, and that makes life just a little bit easier. It makes the code, I think, a little bit cleaner. Okay, so let's start with the first of our tasks that we've identified. Making a list of students displayed in a table, and we're going to be able to click on a student and link to an edit form. So I'm going to create a new file. Now, normally I might create a new HTML file and then save that as PHP, but because I've got that nice function now that will create an HTML header, I don't need to do that, because I don't need to create an HTML file to get the kind of free headers that my nice web editor gives me, the PHP Storm I'm using at the moment. Instead I can just make a PHP file. So I'll do that. I'll call it display student, display student.php. Get rid of the header it's given me, although I must say I always tend to comment, and I try and follow what's a kind of Java doc norm, which is I give a description of what the file will do. So this will be a script to display a list of students, etc, etc. I won't bother wasting your time writing that, but it's a really good idea to comment your file to explain what the file as a whole does, in addition to explaining and commenting any individual lines or functions that you might write. Okay, so moving on. What do we need to do? Well, the first thing I need to do is to require that file that I talked about, the common PHP. So common PHP. This editor I like very much, PHP Storm. There are a number I use. I like PHP Edit if I'm editing in Windows, or I like Eclipse a lot. PHP Storm, I use Sublime Text sometimes for some quick edits. But there are a number of good programmers editors out there, but it's worth having a good programmers editor. And as much as I like Dreamweaver for a lot of things, at the moment I don't really think it's as good a programmer's editor as it is a designer's editor. Okay, so we're going to require that file, and now I'm going to echo a header back. So echo HTML header, which was the name of my function, and I'll pass in the first argument, which is the title, display student list, and then I'll pass in as the second argument my CSS file, which I called student edit.php, and I should have put that in quotes. Okay, so that will give me a nice header, and then what I need to do is I'm just going to echo onto the screen something or other. Okay, so I've got a simple heading 1 with the table. So now I want to connect to my database. So db equals my function called db connect, so it automatically gives me a connection to that database. And now I'm going to construct an SQL statement. So $SQL equals something or other. Now, again, I've already got that. I'm going to cut and paste it, but I can't stress enough that you shouldn't necessarily just make that up. So what I use is SQLite Manager inside Firefox. So I would, construct my SQL statement here and test that that works. Okay, so that's the information I'm getting back. So my SQL statement then, having tested and made sure that worked, is that. So now I'm going to execute that statement and retrieve into something I'm calling statement student, into a variable I'm calling statement student. So I'm going to invoke the method of my database called query and using that SQL. Okay, so that should have given me a record set back, so now I'm going to iterate over that record set. So I'll put in my open and closing construct so I'm not going to make a mistake, and I'm going to fetch back a student object by using that statement object and invoking a method that it has called fetch object, and I'm not passing in any of the arguments to that function. So now I've got back a student as an object, so what I'm going to do is echo now rows of data that represent the information I've retrieved from the database. Okay, so I've got my student object. Now what I'm going to do is echo the information I've just retrieved as a row in my table. So tr, I'll have one column to display the student code. I'll have another column to display the surname, another column to display the forename. In fact, I might well combine the surname and forename in one column. That might make life a bit easier. Well, not make life a bit easier, but it might look a bit nicer on the screen. And I'll display the start year. And then finally, I'll end the row of data. Then I'll echo the end of the table. And I'll echo some message on the screen, but I think what I might do is test this immediately. So, to put a message since I've started, click on the student code to edit that student. Okay. Right, so let's put some data in here. So I've got my student object, and I'm going to display the field called student code that we can see up here. This is the reason I always list the fields. I'm going to display the surname, comma, and then the forename. I'm more like displaying the surname if I spell it correctly. And then here I'm going to display the start year. Okay, so let's just test that and see how that goes. So if I switch back to my editor and refresh that, then I've got display student, and let's see what we get. Oh well, works straight away. So we've got this listing of students. I'll just quickly view page source, and you'll notice it's not really indented as well as it should be. So again, referring back to the last screencast, you can put in \n's and \t's. \n will put something on a new line, \t will indent it. But I'll leave that as an exercise for you to do, because you already know how to do that. Right, now this thing here we want to be able to click on, so that we don't just want to be able to see that, we want to be able to click on it. So I'll cut that out temporarily. Okay, so what we really need then is a link. So an href equals, let's call it edit student form.php as the URL, except we want to pass something to that form, and what we're going to pass is the student code. Notice that the field is called student code. I'm going to create a parameter to pass to this form that's also spelt the same student code, so that I stay consistent in what I'm naming things. So I'm passing student code equals my variable that is the actual student code. So that's the end of that A, and then the thing that the user is going to click on will be the student code that we saw before. Okay, so let me save that, refresh that page, and you'll see that what's happened is that's now become a link. And if I put my mouse over it, And if you look in the status bar at the bottom, it will say edit student form.php student code equals and that particular student code. So this is the way in which I can link one piece of information on one script on one page to another script, another page that can then retrieve that from the request stream. So I'll click on it and we'll get an error of 404 not found because there isn't any such file as that yet. But notice it's passed that in the request stream. So let's create this file called editstudentform.php. So let's go back to the editor, right mouse click, new PHP file, call it that, click OK. I think it puts the extension in automatically, it does. So let's now think about what we've got to do with this. So let's go back to the plan. So in this edit form, we've got to retrieve the primary key, student code, from the request stream, that is, and then we've got to use that as part of an SQL statement to retrieve that data so that we can populate it in a form. So we are retrieving the primary key and displaying it. So let's start with that. Getting the primary key, and the way that we've done that is the way we've done it in the past, which is that we use this isSet ternary if structure, where we're checking if that's in the request stream. If it is, then we store what's in the request stream to that variable, else we store null to that variable. And that means that if someone tries to invoke this form without passing the student code, we won't get a kind of an error condition. And it also means that I can check if that particular thing is empty or not, because obviously if the student code is empty, there's no point in carrying on really, because all bets are off. We need a student code in order to be able to get the data from the database, in order to have something to edit. So there's no point in going on without this. So let's just use the PHP header function, where we can change the location back to our student listing. So what did they call that? Display student. Display student.php. Okay, and then we exit. You would think that header would redirect automatically, but it doesn't in actual fact. It only redirects when the script ends. And since after this if statement I'm going to have other information, and I don't really want to put an else in there, I'm just going to exit automatically, which means that I don't need to bother with an else statement, and I can just code here knowing that this code will only run if student code was not empty. Right, so at this point I want to require my file again, common.php. I'm going to echo my HTML header again, and I'll pass as an argument edit student. In actual fact, I wish I'd used double quotes. Let me just change that double quotes because I'm about to embed a variable. And if I don't use double quotes, then I can't embed a variable. So edit student colon and the variable that I've got that is student code. So that will become the header. And I also want to use that same style sheet. So student edit.css. So next step is I need to connect to my database. So db equals db connect. So I've automatically got a connection to my database. Now I've got that student code, and I'm going to use it as part of an SQL statement. Now my SQL statement is that I need to, in a way, do what I did before, which was, let me just get to that, do this, except I only want to see the student where the student code equals a particular something. So where student code equals, let's just try one out. Let's try that one, L972502. So if I try that as some SQL, oops, I've got an error near student code because I didn't add the words where. And still got some other error from X student, because I put an order by, and you can't have an order by before a where clause. In actual fact, there's only one record, so I don't need an order by clause really. So all of these are good reasons why it's sensible to test your SQL. So that's showing me that particular student. So that's the SQL I'm going to need in order to get back that one particular record. So let's go back to my editor, make up an SQL statement, an SQL variable rather, and store it into there. Except here, I don't really want only that student. I want the student that's represented by this variable called student code. Okay, now we looked at this in the last video, that what I want to do is I don't want to use anything just directly from the request stream because it might contain anything. So what I'm going to use is at least that idea of using db quote, so that I take what was from the request stream and I quote it. That means it not only wraps it in quotes, but it means if the data that's in there contains any quotes, because after all a name or whatever might contain apostrophes or single quotation marks, they will also be quoted and escaped correctly. So I don't need those quotes around my bit of data anymore because it's been quoted by that function db quote. I can just refer to the student code. Okay, so that will retrieve the single record that was in the request stream. So I can now execute that statement. So it will return a student statement if I invoke db query and the SQL, which I've got. Okay. Now, normally what we've done before is we fetch back each record and then loop over them, but there is only one record here, so I don't need to put it inside a loop. I can just say student equals statement student fetch object. Okay, so that gives me back my single record. Right, I want to echo a form on the screen, so I'll echo first of all a header just to make it look nice. And then I'm going to echo a starter form, so echo form. So the action of which is that I've called this edit student form, so I'm going to make the action just edit student. So I find that straightforward, that if the form is called something or other form, the something or other is the actual action. So the form is called edit student form, and the action that will do the actual editing and the saving I've called edit student, without the form part on the end, obviously enough. So that's the action, and at least for testing at the minute, I'm going to make the method equal get. You must change that to post once you finish testing, because get will be written to the logs and you can bookmark it, whereas with an edit action you don't really want to have it ever bookmarked or stored in the logs. So we'll change that to post once we've got it working. So that's my start of my form. So now what I want to do is produce the input elements. So in other words, I'll write one and then I'll just cut and paste so that you can not have your time wasted. So what's going to happen is I'm going to have a label of some description, surname, for instance, and then I'll have an input box, type equals text. I always press that second apostrophe, always get that error. Input type equals text, and then it will have as a value my student object and the field in question, in this case surname. Okay, and it's a non-container tag, so I would end it like that. Now, with a label, from an accessibility standpoint, if a user clicks on the input box, it puts the focus there. But if they click actually on the word surname, of course it doesn't put the focus into the input box, but there's a way around that. And the reason why we'd want a way around that is because some users might not have as fine motor control, so that we can link this label to this input box if we give the input box an ID. So if we give the input box an ID and call it sname or surname, you can call it the same thing, it doesn't really matter. The important thing actually, and it's the important thing I've missed out, is that the input, in order for that to go into the request stream, it must have a name property. So it must have a name property. Now we're giving it an ID in order to link it to the label. The ID could also be surname, but the ID has got nothing to do with what is passed in the request stream. This is purely for accessibility purposes. So here I've called it sname just to emphasize that. Now to link the label to it, we can say for equals sname. And what that does is link this label as being a label for the thing with the ID of sname. And all that means is that I can then click on the word surname and it will put the focus in that box. Okay, so I've just pasted that in, field set with a legend, labels for various fields with the actual label, and then the input that contains the name of something together with its value. The only difference is for the student code box, I've added read-only. In XHTML, previous to HTML5, you couldn't just say read-only, you had to say read-only equals, in quotes, read-only. But when the attribute has the same value as the value, or the same word as the value, in other words, if that's read-only equals read-only, or in the select box, selected equals selected, or checked equals checked, the house rules on this particular course are that you can concatenate that, or you can reduce that rather, into one word, just read-only, or selected, or checked as appropriate. Okay, so let's see that in action. Let's go back to Firefox, and if I just simply refresh that page, it's past student code. That student code is retrieved along, so let's go back once you see that in action. Let's use Victoria Ashworth, and that information we can't edit, so I'm clicking on that, look, and it won't let me edit. But here, if I change Ashworth to Ashworthy and click save, then what it will do is invoke an action passing the information, look, on the visible on the request stream, because we use method get. But now we can use that same information to retrieve student code and surname and forename and start year from the request stream, and then save that data. So that's step 3. So for step 3, I'm going to make a new file, and what was it called? It was edit student form, so the action for that is just edit student. And what do I need to do for edit student? Well, I need to retrieve all the data from the request stream. I need to create an update statement. I execute that update statement and then give some feedback about how that went, because I guess it could go ill, it could be some sort of error, or it could be okay and the record gets saved, and so I'd give feedback, and then in any event I give a link back to the listing. So I'm going to get all of the information from the request stream, and that information was student code, surname, forename, start year. So using the same construct that we've used previously, we're just checking if that's in the request stream. If it is, then we store that, else we store null. So now what we want to do is, if that primary key, student code, isn't empty, in fact we would probably want to check that nothing was empty, but just to begin with at least, and this is relatively rudimentary checking, there is much more that you could do than just checking if it's empty. You could check it falls within valid ranges, etc., or that it's just alpha characters and not numeric characters in the surname and the forename, etc., etc. But again, that's beyond what I'm just trying to teach how to do here. So if that's not empty, then we'll just take that as being okay and we'll save the record. Else it is empty, so we need to give them some feedback. So that's my kind of basic structure. So we need to connect to the database. We'll need to quote all of these values, and then we'll need to construct an update statement for them. So connect to the database, quote all of the values. So using the same structures and constructs that we've done before. So now we need to make an update statement. So to make an update statement, we're going to switch back to here and test it out. Let's change this back. So there's an example. So what we're going to do is update that table, and we'll set surname equals Afonso, where the student code equals something. So let's do that. So I've updated that. Let's now just do a quick select statement. Just to check that worked, so I've got the right idea for my syntax. And it did change the data as I expected. So in other words, the kind of statement that I'm going to need to update things is like this. You already know the update syntax. It's effectively update table set field equals value, comma field equals value, comma field equals value, etc. And then a condition, because if you just left it as update table set field equals value, it will update every record in the database. So we need to reduce it to only the record we want to alter. So where a field equals a value. And in this case, the field equals a value that we're using as our condition is the primary key. So in other words, so we create an SQL, a variable that I'm calling $SQL that equals update this table, set this field to the value that we've quoted, this field to the value we've quoted, this field to the value we've quoted, where the student code equals the student code that was passed in as part of the request. So what do we need to do next? Well, we obviously need to execute that statement, and as we've found out before, it might be a good idea to use the try catch, because in this particular example we might end up with a problem, as you might always do when you are dealing with database actions. So we're going to use that structure. Make a gap there just so that becomes easier to read. So what we'll do is try our statement out first of all. We'll have some sort of result as a consequence of doing this, and what we'll use is our database connection, and we'll invoke the query method again, passing our SQL to it. Okay, now that may work, or it may cause a problem, in which case it will catch it with this exception. But if it works, we're going to give a message back to the user, and if it doesn't work, we'll give a message back to the user. So this is something I alluded to in the last screencast. I'm just going to make up a variable called message and set it equal to record saved. You might want to expand on that and say, record saved, and what the surname and the forename and exactly what was saved was. And I'll just, for the minute, keep it simple. Right, so there's an error, an exception of some description. So in this case, I'll make up the same variable, and except this time I'll say it equals something. I'll say there was an error. Now, it might be useful at this point, at least for us as users, us as developers, to get some idea of what the error message was. So I'm going to embed in there the SQL statement. And because I've embedded it inside a variable, I should have known better and used double quotes, not single quotes, because you can't embed a variable inside single quotes. You can only embed variables inside double quotes. So I've got the message that will say error, but it will tell me what the SQL is, because that might help me spot where I might have made a mistake somewhere. And then to that message, I'm going to add, so dot equals to add on to that whatever the error message was. So I'm using the error object and the its get message method. So now this message will equal that, including the SQL. Actually, I'll put a new line statement there. And also whatever message the database gives me back. Okay. Otherwise, everything went hunky-dory, so I'm going to create a message here as well. So message equals, so what kind of error message is this? Because this is where we didn't have a student code, so we want to tell them you didn't choose a student to edit as the error message, as the error condition. So now what do we want to do? Well, we'll just echo all of that back. We could put it inside a div of some description, and we're going to echo back inside that div this message variable together with finishing off our HTML. Okay, so we'll put the message inside a div, we'll give a link back to our listing, and we'll finish off the HTML. I say finish off the HTML, but in actual fact we haven't yet started the HTML. We've not used that nice header function that we've got. Well, if we're inside here, our header is going to be that we're saving a record, isn't it? So let's echo HTML header with a title of saving record. I might as well use the CSS file, even though there's not a lot to it. Student edit.php. When I say there's not a lot to it, I mean there's not a lot to this output, so we don't really need a style sheet. But if we got to this point here, maybe we should create a different header. So echo HTML header, no data to save. Okay, so let's save that. Let's just try Ashworthy. I click save student. Oh, call to undefined function db connect. Why did I get a call to an undefined function db connect here? Okay, this is me hesitating for you to all shout out what you probably were shouting out right from the very word go, which is I've not required my common.php. So inside there I need to require once common.php, because it's in there that this function is defined. Okay, so refresh that page and it says error saving your record, so that's quite useful. Because we get to see, so how did it do that? Let's look at what we've got here. It did this, look, trying to do that, it created an error, so it jumped to this exception, it said error saving your record, and it's shown us the SQL, so that might give us a bit of a clue. No, attempt to write to a read-only database, so it's nothing to do with my SQL up here, it's to do with my database. Now actually this is a useful error and not one that I'd foreseen, but it's a useful error to have because it's a useful error to know how to solve. With SQLite, SQLite is a file, and because it's a file it needs to have read and write access to the web in order to be able to write to it. So in Unix and on the Mac, which is in actual fact Unix under the hood, that means that this database needs to be writable, and as a matter of fact so does the directory in which it's in. Okay, so let me quickly go to Finder and let me see if I can do it from here before I drop to command line to do it. So student line, if I get info, can't quite see that, so just take my word for it that here, where just off screen, it says read only, and I have to change it to read and write. And I have to do exactly the same thing with the folder that contains it. So I've got to change that to read and write. So let me see if that solves the problem. If it doesn't, then I'll have to drop to the command line and do the same command there. Okay, so now the record is saved. So that's worth remembering, that if you've got a SQLite database, you must make the file itself and the folder that contains it writable to the outside world. If you're on Unix, there's a chmod command with that, which I'll put on the screen now. Chmod command you can execute at your Linux command line, or if you're using an FTP client, you might well find that you can right mouse click on the file and change permissions that way, and you want to give read and write to the outside world, to the file, and to the folder read, write and execute. Okay, so let's go back to display students, and now Victoria has become Ashworthy instead. If we change that again, change it back to Ashworth and click save, it will say record saved, and click back, and now it's Victoria Ashworth. Okay, so hopefully that was useful, and it's helped to explain how we can do a listing, how we can link from a listing to an edit form, how we use that to get the information from the request stream and save it. Remember though, as a final set of steps, what we need to do is change these to post when that's all working, and in the form we change the method from get to post, so that information that was sent is not bookmarkable and it doesn't appear in the server logs. Okay, thanks a lot. Over and out.